All right, let's get started. Before we get into anything else, I just want to say thank you, everybody, for joining me today. I have yet to actually conduct a workshop like this through Zoom and Mural. I've done various permutations of other types of online workshops, but the combination of these two is going to be novel for me. I've obviously done some run-throughs, but it'll be an experiment. And I also want this to feel a little bit more like an actual workshop than like a webinar. So I do want folks to feel comfortable, speaking up, asking questions. I'll pause at some key places along the way to ask if there are any questions. So certainly at that point, you can unmute and ask questions. I hope we'll kind of have the feeling of being able to chat with each other live. But then if you don't want to do that, or you don't feel comfortable, or you don't know if the question's relevant, you want to throw it in the chat. That's the other place I'm going to keep my eye on. So in the public chat Zoom window, feel free to just toss any questions in there. And then when I get a chance here and there, I'll try to take a look. And then anything I don't actually cover or talk about as we go through, I'll have some time at the end to come back and talk through those questions or take some more Q&A. So I think that's it. Let me double check to make sure I've let everyone from the waiting room in. I think we're good to go. And we are recording. Just to answer this question right off the bat, I will make these slides available. I'll share them pretty shortly after the workshop. I like to wait till afterwards because if a good question comes up that I think is worth adding to a slide somewhere just for future reference, I'll do that. But otherwise, what you see today, I will share the slides soon after. So let's get started. You know me, I'm Jen Briselli. I'm the SVP of Experience Strategy and Service Design at MadPow. And that basically means that I lead a team of researchers, designers, strategists, behavior scientists, and all kinds of smart folks. And what we do is mostly the strategic fuzzy front end of a lot of the types of design work that MadPow does. So certainly we're involved in building and designing the actual solutions that we craft, but we really play in that kind of fuzzy space where we're making sense of everything. And so what I'm going to talk about today in terms of participatory design is really a key part of that process. And in a nutshell, participatory design is kind of a mindset shift for some folks more than like a specific type of process or method. And so what I am going to talk about today is what it is. So for some folks who've maybe joined me in past workshops or just have maybe interacted with me through past work with MadPow, some of this might be a review, but I can't really talk about how to do this in a remote socially distanced way without actually talking about what it is. So I am going to give a bit of a primer on participatory design and also why you might use it, what's the value of it. Also, how's it been successful? A couple examples just to illustrate what this can look and feel like for you, and how you actually do it. And this is the hardest to do virtually because if we were all in person together, I would actually take us through some activities where we actually engage in the types of things you would do in one of these types of participatory design sessions. Since I can't do that, I'm going to try to approximate that as best I can via Mural. So hopefully you got a link in the Mural or in the invite to a Mural board. And when we get to the parts in today's session where I want folks to use that, I will also switch my screen and I will screen share the Mural board. And I'm going to hope that that works for folks. If anybody can't access the Mural board for some reason, if the network you're on, or if you're at work or what have you, if it's blocked, don't fret. I think just being able to watch and view what I will have screen shared in the Zoom should at least help in terms of making sure everybody can follow along. But I do encourage you to open up the Mural if you have access, because actually having folks in there and adding stickies when we get to that will help generate the conversation that I think will teach everyone. And then last but not least, I want to also add a little bit of like, okay, we live in COVID times. So everything I normally teach people about participatory design is really focused on a lot of in-person work, but that doesn't have to be the case. And even at MadPow, we've had to get more creative over the last 6 months or so in terms of how we might conduct these activities remotely. And that's not actually totally new. There have been times in the past where a global pandemic wasn't the reason we had to do something remotely, but we had to send packs or kits to people because they were located far away and we still wanted that geographic audience included, or we had to build little stations because we knew we couldn't get someone like busy doctors to come and sit with us for 3 hours. But if we built a little self-serve station and asked them to do something on their own time, it was more successful. So we've actually got learnings from how to do this type of work creatively that helps serve us today in global pandemic quarantine times. So I like to start with this quote from Henry Ford. You guys have probably heard it. If you haven't, congrats, now you've heard it. But basically, if I had $1 for every time I heard this quote used, usually in conjunction with innovation or something of that sort, I'd be retired. If I had $1 for that, I'd be like rich. And even more so, if I had $1 for every time I heard this quote used to justify not talking to users or not working directly with your customers in the design of products and services, I'd be like funding charities. I hate that I hear this type of sentiment used in that way. And it's actually a fundamentally misunderstood quote, because we don't actually even know if Henry Ford said it. So I hate it in general. And I would answer that if asking people what they want doesn't work, because it is true. I mean, if you ask somebody who's not a trained designer or not an expert in the field, they can't always articulate their needs. Well, what are we supposed to do? If we can't ask them what they want to get what we need to know how to design value and sell things or to improve lives, then what are we supposed to do about it? Cue participatory design. That's the answer. So that's kind of how I look at this. It's basically a way of learning what people need from them directly without having to ask them directly, what do you want? Can you design the screen for me? You know? So let's talk about participatory design. What is it? Well, it's an approach that essentially invites all the stakeholders in a product or service or experience into the design process itself. And so that can look and feel different depending on, again, what the service or experience or product is that you're designing. But this means not only end users, it also means the employees or the other folks that are part of internal structures that also mediate or give rise to that experience. And that's actually where service design does kind of overlap with a lot of this. But essentially, it's a way of better understanding what their needs are and trying to sometimes preempt problems or challenges instead of just designing around them. But I also want to talk about what it's not. So it's not just a variation on focus groups. I get that question from time to time. You know, if participatory design is just getting people together in a room and going through some activities together, isn't it just a focus group? It's not. I would love in a separate session to talk at your length about why focus groups have limited value. And usually they're dominated by a couple opinions that sway most of the room and don't really provide as much insight as you can get from other types of methods. They're not useless, they have their place, but this is not a focus group. It's also not a way to make your users do your job for you. Sometimes people say, well, you know, I'm the designer, I'm the expert. Like, why am I asking somebody who doesn't know anything about this stuff to do any kind of design work? But that's not the goal. The goal is not to actually have these folks design the final solutions, but rather to have them tell us in a deeper way what they need, in a way that maybe they haven't been able to tell us before and we haven't been able to learn before. It's also not a single prescriptive method or tool. As I mentioned, it's certainly not, I'm not going to give you guys anything that says, do this, step 1, step 2, step 3. That's not how it works. It's really more of a philosophical approach to research and design that you can bake into the work you already do. So I'm not about to suggest everybody should go and swap this for whatever they do in their practice today. It's not rigidly defined, certainly not something that everybody would agree on. There's probably a million people who can give this talk and give it in a million different variations. But this is what I have learned over my years of work and in both learning this from others who are expert, including one, Liz Sanders, who I refer to quite a lot because she taught me almost everything I know about this, but also from my time at MadPow putting this to work with clients. And I will also add that you'll hear a lot of terms thrown around here. So co-design, co-creation, you know, collaborative, co-production, all these are kind of variations on the same theme. It's also not a holy grail. It's not going to solve all your problems. So sometimes we get that, you know, kind of a habit where we've learned something is new and exciting and actually has good results and we want to throw it at everything. But there are times where this just isn't the right approach. So in a nutshell, participatory design is involving the people that we're serving through design as participants in the design process itself. And if you remember nothing else from today, then remember that. I also like to show this, I guess it's a graph or a little bit of a diagram, essentially because, and this isn't mine, this is a diagram from an article that Liz Sanders and Hugh Dubberly wrote about participatory design, but how it fits into the larger world of design and research. But I like to show this because it helps kind of frame what I'm talking about when I say this is not a method, it's more of a mindset. So a lot of folks I think are very familiar with the concept of design from an expert mindset, where we're thinking about ourselves as designers, we're the experts, whether it's experts in the design process or experts in the subject material. And we look at our customers as users, as test subjects, and we're trying to learn about them and glean information from them. And there's nothing bad about that. I'm certainly not going to suggest that that's a problem or that we should get away from that. It's just that's the kind of prevailing way that people do design work, especially in the West, especially for the past several decades. And then there's also this difference between a design-led or research-led approach. So I think a lot of folks probably identify a little bit more with a research-led approach. They try to do the work to understand needs, to understand the usability of a product, to understand the value proposition, to check and evaluate things and then to make improvements on it, but it's still research-led versus Design-led is where you design the thing first and you learn through making. I guess you could make an argument that maybe lean type approaches could fit up here, but ultimately this is also where things like speculative design and you know, critical designs sort of tend to work as well. Building things to make a point or to learn something or to teach a lesson. But at the other side over on the right, if you think about participatory design as sort of the opposite of an expert mindset, it's looking at our customers or users as participants in the process, and they're co-creating the things that are going to ultimately serve them and help them achieve their goals. Really, if you take that to its extreme, someday I would love to be able to say that we've all put ourselves out of a job. There are no more designers because we've somehow built a system where folks can solve problems for themselves. And really, instead of a designer, my title is facilitator. But I think that's a little bit far off and maybe more of a utopia than a reality. So it's a little bit somewhere in between around how we can figure out how to bring people into the design process with more of a participatory mindset and to use that in a way that's complementary with what makes us experts. I do get questions from people a lot that are like, well, wouldn't you argue that you're just asking these folks to do something that they're not capable of doing? And my response to that is individuals are the experts of their own experience. So this person who has never read a book about design thinking, doesn't know the empathy, prototype, test, review, you know, they don't know any of that. They know their life, they know their experience, and they're more of an expert in what their pain points are and what their experiences are than you will ever be. So if it helps to think about those users as experts to justify this type of work, then do it. I'm going to skip this one because it kind of basically says what I just said. But that's a kind of good way to think about participatory design and where it might fit into your practice. Because if you're someone that already does this, that's great. Maybe this is like more about just learning some of the nuances and ways to improve what you do. And if this is really novel and where you work or how you work is really from an expert mindset, maybe just this alone is enough to kind of get you thinking about how to bring a little bit more participatory co-design process into your craft. I also want to talk about where this fits in the design process for a lot of folks. So at MadPow, we look at our process as it's not linear and it's not really set in stone. We don't have like the MadPow way, but we like to refer to the double diamond diagram. So those of you who have seen this will know it's adapted from the UK Design Council diagram, but it's a good way to think about where in this process something like co-design or participatory design will fit. So the beginning of that process is discovery, and the arrows in this diagram, they go apart because it's meant to represent divergent thinking. So the goal of this part of the process is to discover as much as we can. We do research. We try to understand and take in as much information as we can without prematurely focusing or narrowing our aperture. And so it's really important to keep a very divergent type of focus at this point. Whereas at whatever point makes sense, we would pivot to a more convergent phase. That's why the arrows come together again. And now we're synthesizing all that knowledge. So it's important not to try to come in with solutions and biases and predisposed notions if we can, or at least to put them on hold. It's a colleague of mine made this comparison and I'll never forget it, so I use it all the time. Dr. Amy Bucher, if you're fans. She was once talking about this with me and a client. She said, it's like with the Marie Kondo process, before you can actually start to clean things and let go of things and move things, you have to just get it all out of the drawers. So take all of the stuff out of your sock drawer, your old t-shirts, and just lay them out on the bed. And it's a little bit of a mess and it can be a little bit terrifying, but it's a way to get all the information in one place before you then sort of turn to that synthesis mindset. So we do that next. We synthesize what we have found. We wait for patterns to emerge and for insights to crystallize. And then we actually return to another divergent thinking phase where we're generating ideas. And similar to discovery, it's really important that you let that be divergent and you don't prematurely focus. So you're trying to create ideas. This is where you get like the TV or movie style design process where we're brainstorming and putting Post-its on clear glass walls and scribbling with markers and what have you. This is where we're doing that type of generative ideation process. And then lastly, it's another convergent phase where we're basically agreeing to pursue one or two or however many make sense of those ideas, whether it's prototyping or straight up building. And then of course, evaluating, you know, and repeating this whole process. So where does participatory design fit into this process? Essentially in two places. Well, it's not really cut and dried, but essentially earlier or later. So if you do it earlier in the process, you're going to get things like design principles and direction. The stuff that people create in a participatory design session or activity, isn't going to be a viable solution concept if you're doing it towards the beginning of this process, because you're in a little bit more of an understanding mode. So you're trying to learn, you're trying to uncover unmet needs and sort of tacit, latent, unspoken desires and problems. So the stuff you get out of this work is going to be more about principles and direction. You might get characteristics or features of something that would be a solution, but you're not going to get actual viable solution concepts. Whereas if you do this type of work a little bit later in the process, and you can do it multiple times throughout a process, the participatory design activities that happen later in the design cycle can actually give you viable solution concepts or something close to it. I mean, sometimes folks can't actually design a screen, but they will produce something that looks eerily similar to a wireframe. And then that's where the expertise of a trained designer can come in, refine, and take it from there. So depending on how you use it, you can certainly get a lot of different types of output. I want to just pause for a second. I'm going to take a quick look at the chat. So far, so good. I don't see any questions. Let me make sure nobody's in the waiting room. All right, we're good. Let's continue. So why is it useful? Essentially, I think this quote really beautifully sums it up. Participatory design methods, especially generative or making activities, provide a design language for non-designers who are the future users of the output to imagine and express their own ideas for how they want to live, work, and play in the future. So we're giving them a language. We're giving them tools that they don't have to tell us things that they otherwise might not be able to tell us. And it can look a lot of ways. I will say that people who are familiar with this type of work tend to really hone in on the stuff like this. So this is from an activity that's a magic object or magic blank. And essentially it's a generative or making activity where we give participants a bunch of craft materials and have them make something fantastical that is supposed to be like a perfect magic solution, and it solves all their problems. And it creates fun looking stuff like this. It's great for visuals and storytelling and for sharing with execs and buy-in and such, but you know, it's just one of many types of activities. But essentially it can take a lot of forms depending on what you're trying to achieve. In this case, this is a group of nurses. They're not creating cute objects or physical prototypes. They're actually designing a floor and a workflow for like a nurse's station. So depending on what you're trying to achieve, the actual outputs can look very different and might not be physical at all. It might be things like scripts or acting something out or just indicating the way that a workflow goes, you know, from a qualitative or emotional standpoint. But almost all the participatory sessions that I'm involved with anyway, almost always include at least some type of generative activities. So that's not all we do, but generative activities are really magical because they help uncover latent needs. And I love this diagram from Liz Sanders, which talks a lot about, from a book that talks a lot about generative methods. But this one diagram I think really sums it up, because if you think about the types of research methods that we all tend to use in our practice, right? The very most surface level is literally asking people, talking to them, maybe surveys, or in this case, interviews. And those are successful when they're well designed, but what they're gonna get you is the explicit knowledge that people have. And it's what people are gonna say to us and what people think. But it's not always 100% what they do. And many of us have learned people might tell us one thing in an interview, but then if we observe them via contextual inquiry or shadowing or a day in the life type of follow along, people don't always do what they say they do. And sometimes it's not even something they're conscious of the difference. But those types of observation methods get us a level deeper to see what people actually do. And that's important. And I think what most people don't realize is you can get a level deeper from that. And that's doing certain types of generative ideation activities where people make something. And even if what they're making is totally silly, it really does uncover the next level down. It helps people start to think about and share what their deepest needs are in a way that they don't have language for in an interview or even watching them behave. And so this is where participatory design that makes use of generative and ideation activities really gets valuable, because it helps us get to those things we really didn't have access to in our other research methods. So it's all complementary. Very often I actually recommend we do a few interviews and then do participatory design, because the interviews kind of get us the foundational beginner knowledge about how people think about what they're talking about. And then we know how to dig deeper when we design participatory design. So just a couple quick examples. What does this actually end up looking like in practice? So this was from a project where we were redesigning a member portal, and we asked people to design a magic screen. So you'll notice we didn't give them actual like interface stencils. So we didn't give them buttons. We didn't give them things that look like an actual UI. And we also didn't ask people to draw on like a completely blank sheet of paper. We gave them stuff. We gave them stickers and things. Some people did just draw from scratch and some people used stickers. But I have always found that when you hand somebody a blank sheet of paper, it's so intimidating. Even if you love to draw, it's so intimidating. So giving people stuff, substrate to move around, helps unlock that and makes people a little bit more comfortable starting to generate things, especially if they've got a hang up about, I'm not creative, I don't draw, I'm bad at this. You know, you kind of give them pieces. It's almost a little bit like someone who's afraid to cook, but if you give them a meal kit with the prepackaged stuff and a little bit of little instructions, suddenly it's a little bit easier to engage with. So it's a little bit like that. We try to give people materials to work with rather than just say, draw what you want, tell me what you want. In this case, we did this work as part of the research to understand what this member portal was supposed to serve for the users. And you know, you could do this work without participatory design and just design a website based on good UX best practices. But actually doing this work helped us uncover some key things that we weren't really aware of in terms of their expectations about what an insurance portal might do. So in this case, for example, users often talk about wanting to have an easy to navigate site and, you know, answers at their fingertips. So we could have just tried to make it, quote, easy to navigate. But when they created these imaginary screens, they actually focused a lot less on easy navigation and more on just making sure the interface would know who they were and like preemptively know the questions they were there to ask. This was a few years back. And so there was a lot of, I want it to be like Amazon. I wanted to just know what I need, you know, so it was a little bit of an aha, but having them draw the sites or the screens a certain way helped us understand what was more important than a clear information architecture was a very primary piece of the screen needed to be that first guess, an anticipatory experience, really. What do we think you're here for? Let's take a good guess. And if it's wrong, it's okay because we made a good attempt and we can quickly guide you to where you need to be. So there was a little bit of an aha there that was really important. In another example, these are part of journey maps that people made for themselves. And by the way, you're probably all familiar with journey maps, but more often than not, journey maps are something that an internal team is creating to represent a journey or an experience. How about having users actually create their own journey maps to represent their own journey? So it's interesting to see the similarities and the variations. And this was for a project where we were trying to understand the mental model that people have related to coverage and benefits for insurance. And you'll notice compared to the last example, so the other one that I showed was actual screens. These people were making wireframes even though they didn't realize. In this case, there were no wireframes. We had them make some journey maps and then we had them build magic objects that would solve problems based on a prompt that we gave them. And this was one of the objects they created. And this person created this object and then described all the features. And if you look at the features and just cover up the object, what you get is a nice feature list for the app that might solve these problems or for the digital experience that these folks are going to be looking for. A lot of them also created things that ended up really representing an Amazon Alexa, or a Google Home device. They didn't say as much, but they basically were saying what I really need is an assistant, a digital assistant that will achieve this for me, or that I can ask a question and it'll just give me an answer. And even though these 4 things look super different, they were all kind of pointing to the same thing. This was from an activity that I call Mad Libs. I'm a big fan of using metaphor to understand how people make sense of things. So especially if you're trying to understand mental models, metaphors are really illuminating. And so this was an activity where we had people complete Mad Libs, basically health insurance coverage is like blank because blank. And we did one round where we actually gave them out of a hat, like nouns. I just had a whole bunch of nouns: windshield wipers, a sandwich, a lifelong friend. And they had to draw them out of a hat, and then they had to explain why health insurance is like that item, which I know sounds a little strange, but actually it really starts kind of getting wheels turning for people and thinking about similarities and differences, and we understand their mental model better. Then for the second round, we actually let them decide on what noun they wanted to use. So now you tell us, what is insurance most like? So this was a good one where we could point to some of the mini epiphanies we had as a result of this type of process. They helped us realize that for this work, there was no prevailing mental model. We thought there might be. It was going to help design the output of this work to know that there's a mental model that we can design around and make it make sense. And of course, this revealed to us like, oh shoot, there is no mental model. Everybody's got an extremely different understanding of this. So there's not going to be a way to design a digital experience that maps to that mental model at all. And actually, it kind of changed the way that this particular client was thinking about the coverage and benefits type of work they were doing. Obviously, the coverage itself doesn't change, but the way that it's created and the way that it's shared in digital means and the way that people engage with knowledge about it is a little bit different now because of this. So I'm going to talk a little bit about how to do it, but I'm going to take a look at the chat. To what extent are you transparent about the purpose of generative activities, the ones that are more abstract? Do you tell them what you're hoping to learn, or is it more like a workshop? Oh, we tell them. Yeah. I mean, unless it's a super sensitive topic or there's some reason where that would actually bias or make it less likely we would get good knowledge, we're very transparent about all of this. And I always say explicitly at the very beginning of a session, I know you guys aren't designers. Don't worry. We're not expecting you to be creators or things that you don't feel comfortable calling yourselves. I always tell people, you're the experts in your own lives. And so we're basically consulting with you, the experts, about what your life has been like or what your experience is like. And when we do an activity like this, we'll tell them what you guys build is going to help us build a better version, or it's going to help us do X, Y, Z. So sometimes we keep the client confidential depending on if, you know, various reasons, but we almost always tell them exactly why we're doing the activities that we're doing. So here's what I'm going to go through today, and we're going to do some activities together. So one is to talk about framing. A lot of people want to just know, okay, what are the activities? How do you do them? How do you set up the logistics for this kind of work? And honestly, I love that people want to go there right away. What are the activities? How do we do it? But almost like any other type of research or design activity, you've actually got to do more work up front to make sure you're very clear on what you're trying to achieve, to frame it up properly, and then to also make sure that the planning actually is set up in a way that's going to make everybody successful. So I honestly would say most people want to rush right to thinking about how to do it and how to facilitate it, but you should really be spending a lot more time planning and framing up what you're going to do. And then there's also a lot to think about with analyzing. I'll touch on this briefly at the end, but analyzing the outputs of this work, it's probably its own day-long workshop, but it's also more art than science. So you're totally qualified to do it even today. It's just one of those things that I think scares people, because people might be more used to getting surveys or interview transcripts versus a bunch of pipe cleaner objects. How do you make sense of those? So I'll let you know, we'll talk through that a little bit, but you know, as a spoiler, the main thing to remember is that the only thing that really matters is how people talk about what they create. The actual objects they make, at the end of the day, you can throw them away. That's what they say when they talk about it that really matters. So I'm going to go through each of these four in a teeny bit more detail, and hopefully we can do some interactive along the way. So let's try that. First experiment, I'm going to switch over to the mural board, but hopefully you got into mural, or if you're not there yet, you can take a minute. I'm going to leave this URL up for maybe a minute. Excuse me. And in the mural board, which I'm going to hopefully get into now, unlock that section. Okay. Hopefully, if you're in the mural board, you can see the section at the top left. And I see a ton of cursors flying around, so that's good. I would love you guys to do a couple things. And I will switch over to screen share the mural board shortly, but for those who are still watching the Zoom to see the screen or the URL, I'll leave it up for a little bit. I would love for you to add a sticky with your name and your company, or anything else you want to say about yourself, maybe title or something if we want to know if you're a designer or researcher, et cetera. But anything you want to share, or just your name is fine. So add a sticky. There are some instructions right in the mural there if you're not sure, I've never used it. And then I would love it if you could find an image and drop it in. We are going to do that again later. So my logic here is that if we can try it now and see if it works and people can get the hang of it, it'll save us a little time later, but also it's okay if that doesn't work. Images work pretty easily with Mural if you have an image on your desktop, or if you have one handy, or if you go to Google image search and copy, and it's basically copy paste. So if you want to spend a few minutes doing that, let me zoom in here. All right, and then I'm going to switch my screen over to Chrome. There's a question about how to rename guest avatars. I think once you're in with an avatar, you might not be able to, and it's okay if you can't. When you first join, when you first come to the mural via the link, I know that it asks you for a name, but if you leave it blank, or if perhaps you might be already logged into a mural, if you already use it in your work, it might not let you rename it, which is not a big deal. You might be able to right click on your icon at the bottom, and it might be an option there, but I don't see it for mine. So either way, it's no big deal. I don't need to know who is who with the cursors. I just like seeing the names on the stickies to know who all is here. So hopefully you guys can see. I'll hang out here for a couple minutes. And just as a preview, what I plan to do is as we use Mural together, we'll do a couple activities, and from each activity to the next, I'll be using a couple things that come from each previous activity. We may try voting to decide on those, or I might just pick good candidates. We'll have to see how things go.
I'm being dense. Where are people getting the stickies from?
So there's a number of ways. First, if you look at the left, I don't know if you guys can see on my screen, there's a little sticky icon here, and that drawer slides out, and then you can just grab a sticky and plop it down. So that's one way. Another is to right click. So if you can see my cursor, I'm right clicking, and then I get this, and I can, oops, it thinks I'm clicking on something.
I don't know, my mouse isn't letting me grab when you say grab it.
On the drawer over here on the left.
Yeah, nothing picking up.
That's strange. That I don't know, but there are a couple ways. If you try in a, oh man, you guys can resize these images, by the way. They're huge. I'm gonna resize them for you shortly. In fact, I'm gonna make the astronaut a little smaller just so that it's, sorry if the astronaut was yours. If you want to move it, you can.
Right, I'm still stuck.
So, okay, if you are in the mural and you find a blank area, so hopefully you can see my cursor, I'm kind of up near the right now.
Yep.
Right click there, you might get the menu here that says add sticky note. That's another way to do it. And then last but not least, if that doesn't work.
Oh, of course, I'm trying to do it on your screen share. That's not helping it.
That could be it. Make sure you open up the mural. The third way, by the way, pro tip, if you guys are, like Mural, there's the method to get it from the menu over here. So the drawer at left, there's the right click to add it from this menu. And then last but not least, you can always copy paste. So I put this one up here to just copy paste. So your typical Control C, Control V, or Mac or, PC equivalent, you can copy paste somebody else's. All right, loving this though. Looks like most of you have the hang of adding stuff. And really this is all we're gonna need to do today is be able to add stickies and be able to grab and find and add images. Okay. I am gonna move on. Oh, I see a quick question in here. Do you record explanations? You mean during the sessions, during the participatory design sessions? I try to. I'll mention this a little bit later when we talk about facilitating. The short answer is we try to record and capture everything as best we can. I will sometimes do an actual audio recording when I ask people to explain. I'll have like my iPhone or a mic or something just kind of out. It's hard because you don't want to put people on the spot with like a mic in their face or be capturing video, and it makes people a little bit less likely to share very candidly. But when you put people at ease, by the time you get to the point where you're explaining something that they've created, it's usually a pretty easy thing to get people to talk about, and they're usually very comfortable letting you record. So I do try to record so that we can go back later and refer to it. Other times, if you can't record or if just the logistics don't allow, taking tons of photos and really copious notes. So we absolutely do try to capture as much of that as we can. I also didn't even think about it, but I'm really thankful that you guys have all kept this safe for work, right? I didn't even think about having to say, like, let's be appropriate with our photos. So you're a fantastic crowd, and I'm glad that I'm not regretting this activity immediately. Okay, so I'm gonna wrap this part up and go back to the PowerPoint. Sorry, I'm really enjoying how many photos of what I assume are pets or other animals. I'm loving it. I love it. Well done. Anybody have any objections to me returning to the PowerPoint? If you speak up now or hold your peace. Okay. All righty, let's go back. Okie doke. So now, oops, let me get my screen arranged here. What we're going to do next is talk about problem statements. So as I mentioned earlier, the very first thing you want to do when you're planning sessions like this is spend some time doing the actual framing. I don't know if it's just because we all tend to be very productive. I think a lot about what the actual experience is going to be like. That's how my brain is wired. It's why I'm in experience design. It's probably true for a lot of you. So I tend to think immediately about like, how's the session going to go? What are we going to do? What's the agenda? but you really got to back it up and stop before you even get to that point and ask, what are we trying to solve? What are we trying to learn? What are our research objectives? So even though I often characterize this type of work as both research and design, because it helps us uncover insights and it helps us generate solution, either concepts or principles, it's like a 2-for-1. From the research side, it is still important to have a research plan, a research goal, to understand what questions we're trying to solve. And some people skip this, and that's their downfall. So when you want to frame up and understand what you're trying to solve, you've got to spend some time on it together as a group or whoever's involved in this process. And so on the mural board, I will unlock the next section momentarily, but if you're not looking at the Zoom window right now, please do, so I can just give you the instructions. Then I'll go back to the mural. So what I'm going to ask you guys to do when I unlock the next section, there's 3 broad topics in there. One is just about health and wellness. One is about financial well-being, and the other is, I think, education related. I just picked 3 very broad topics, knowing, you know, we've got a mix of folks in the session. If one of those areas is what you work on most of the time, feel free to focus on that. Or if you want to pick something different, you can. But I'm going to ask people to basically, within one of those 3 areas, think about your personal experiences within that topic and identify a problem space or a challenge related to that. So we're going to start with a very broad topic, and then we want to narrow it down to a very specific how might we type of challenge. Normally, this would be guided by the work you're doing and what you're trying to understand and what you're trying to build for your users. But for today, we're going to just brainstorm some ideas, and we'll pick one that I think will generate the right type of activity. So in this case, we're not doing it the way we would really. We're kind of just making it up as we go. But whether this comes from your work in your day job, knowing what type of things you're trying to solve, or for you as a person, not as a designer, but maybe you've had some experiences with the health system recently or with financial planning or whatever, if there's something that's top of mind for you, that's going to be what I want to use today, because we're going to use these later for additional planning into the next piece of the activity. And when I say how might we, I have to be real. I roll my eyes at that phrase at this point, man. It is so overused, but it is the right way to think about it. So we want to think about how might we do something, accomplish something. We're creating a challenge statement or a problem statement. So we start with this broad area of topic, and then we want to think of some problem statements. And you are welcome to think of more than one. You can add as many of these as you want. So what I'm going to do is flip back over to the mural. Hopefully you will see momentarily that section 2 is now open. Well, it's really section 1. And let me share the mural again. Okay. So hopefully you are looking at the mural now. If you want to just watch the Zoom, you can, if you're just doing that. But in the mural, there are 3 big boxes, and there are 3 broad topics there. Let's spend a couple minutes now, not a long time, just a couple minutes, brainstorming ideas for those types of how might we questions. How might we help people save better for retirement? How might we help people make healthier lifestyle choices? I'm just making stuff up. I'm not even reading Post-its right now, but that's kind of where we're at. And what we're going to ultimately do is we're going to pick a couple of these to bring into the next activity. And I either might have us vote or I might just pick them, but let's spend a few minutes doing that. Question about when we do vote. If we vote here, I'm going to have you vote in mural, and it'll be something that I will launch and you will see. So don't worry, I'll walk you through it. I am not going to be using any of the Zoom poll function today. We're not doing any polls in Zoom. looks to me like you guys are also, you do have the hang of flying around Mural, moving Post-its around, copy and pasting. That's good. And obviously feel free to use whatever colors you want. We're not using any colors for any particular meanings. Somebody made a circle, good for you. Break outside the box a little bit. I love it.
All right, I'm clearly technology challenged because I was struggling with just seeing in Mural the whole page. Like I couldn't get off of.
Like to zoom in?
Yeah. I just dropped out of it because I'm going to go back into it. But
if you can look at the Zoom window, if you can see my screen in Zoom,
yeah,
you can, hopefully you can see I'm right at the kind of full canvas view.
yeah.
There's a
How
couple
did you
ways
get to the full canvas view. That's what I can't seem to get to.
This little thing down at the bottom right is like a world map. If you're a gamer, it's like a view of everything. But what it can let you do is you can use this to zoom in, if that's a little bit easier. If you've got, you know, depending on what kind of trackpad or mouse you have, you might be able to do this with your fingers on the mouse or on the laptop trackpad. You can zoom in the usual ways with like pinch and zoom and all of that. But if none of that's working very well, then this little guy down here at the bottom right, this little image of the whole canvas, you can slide the slider from the plus to the minus to zoom in and out. And then you can click this hand to put it in move mode. So right now I'm a cursor and I just move around to grab stuff. But if I click the hand, that lets me actually like grab and move the canvas around, which can make it a little easier to get, you know, into whatever level you want to be. Does that help? Did that work?
Yeah, I think I'm struggling a little bit with my own technology here, where because I have a remote mouse, it's
oh yeah, I find some days Mural just doesn't move right for me, and I don't know why. So you're not alone. It's definitely not perfect. But if you're able to even view it, and if not, worst case scenario, you know, I will keep this on screen for a little bit and we'll look through it. I am going to wrap this part soon. I think people are slowing down. I'm actually pretty psyched about the number of things you guys put in here, though. This is awesome. Looks like we have a lot of health people and then some financial and education folks. What I'm going to ask you to do next, if you're done, if you're kind of out of ideas or you're just kind of done with trying to come up with more, if you haven't, take a look around at the other Post-its. So just take a browse at what's there. Read all of the ones that are there. I think we're doing good on time, so I'm going to try voting. So I'm going to wait 1 more minute. And if you're still typing something, wrap up the one that you're typing and make whatever one you're adding right now the last one. And then I'm going to initiate the voting. So if you guys do use Mural and don't use voting, here's a chance to see how it works. It's kind of cool if it works. So take a minute to wrap up your last Post-it and then take a browse through. And then what I'm going to do is turn on voting. And if you are watching in the Zoom, you'll see how this happens if you're an admin. If you're just looking at the Mural, you'll soon see the screen that tells you to start voting. So I'm going to call this voting for a problem statement. And I'm going to give everybody 3 votes, okay? And I'm the only one who can end this, not you. So what you'll now see, if you're in the Mural, you will see a thing that has popped up and explain to you that a voting session has started. And how that works is that you just click one of the Post-its or the stickies or a card, they call it, and that adds a vote. And if you're like, oh shoot, I didn't mean to do that, you just hit Shift click to remove the vote. And you get 3 votes and they're anonymous. So once more, you're gonna take some time, read through them. We'll do this quickly, don't spend too much time on it. It's not a big deal either way, just to enable the next activity. But you're gonna pick 3, and you can also put all 3 of your votes on one if you really want. But what this is gonna do is basically determine which of these problem statements we're gonna bring forward into the next activity to really focus on a little more. So you click on it to vote, To remove a vote, you shift click, and then you get 3 of those. So hopefully you're in there now. If you are looking at the Zoom, you can watch me vote for something. I'm going to click on that and see how a little red dot just appeared. And you'll see that showed up because that's showing me my vote. It's not showing me everybody else's votes right now. It's just showing me my vote because voting is happening. And it would be really confusing if they all showed up at once. So I'm going to add my 3 votes. And I'm actually just totally at random going to add them to 1 in each box. So I'm not even reading them. So nothing personal, guys. And now I'm done and it tells me I have no votes left and I can see that you guys are all voting. So I will give you another moment. All right, I'm going to give you about 1 more minute. And if you don't get to vote in that minute, then too bad, it's too late. All right, I'm going to end the voting session. So hopefully what you will see now is that there will be a whole bunch of red dots. There's a little summary. If you're watching the Zoom, you can see here, there's a summary. So it tells me which thing has the most votes, which is kind of nice. This one, how might we ensure equal access to elementary education in a pandemic? Top vote, with good reason. Next one, how might we address racial disparities in healthcare? Next one, how might we improve financial education for minority? This is awesome because you guys picked 3 that are 1 from each box. So well done. I couldn't have planned it better myself. Let me close this down. And what I'm gonna do, just while I'm thinking about it, is grab the winners. I'm going to unlock the next section. I'm going to move this guy, make it a little smaller, and then take the winners over here. The best part of this is if you're watching my camera, you can see me like staring at this like I can't see anything, and I'm sure my face is right up in the camera. So that'll be great to watch on the recording, I'm sure. All right, I have moved these 3 to the next activity. We're not gonna do it quite yet, but I've got them saved there. So we're gonna come out of the mural for now, just, you know, essentially let things be. Don't start anything there, ignore it. Actually, I can force that. And now we're gonna go back to the Zoom and I'm gonna go back to the PowerPoint. So hopefully you're joining me back in Zoom and you can see my screen again. So we just did a fantastic job of this. We thought about what we want to focus on, what we want to think about, how we might improve, etc. We voted on those. Fantastic. So let's talk about framing and how I do this. Again, that none of this is cut and dried, but these are the types of things that if you're planning sessions like this, you really need to be thinking about. So first off, who are we trying to include? And who are we talking about when we talk about participatory design? Who are the stakeholders? Who are going to be the co-creators? Who are the end users? They're not always the same. They might be, they might not be. What are the challenges and the goals, right? So what are the things that we are facing as a challenge right now? What are the goals for the work? As I mentioned earlier, we should have research goals to understand things. We should have goals that kind of guide the overall work that we're embarking on. We should also call out questions and unknowns. It's important to call out questions that we either hope to answer or we acknowledge may not be answered, and things that we don't know. So any uncertainty that we're just moving forward with despite not having the answer. It's also good to think about the assumptions you're making. So we might go into a session making assumptions about the user group or about their needs. And it doesn't mean we necessarily have to validate those. It's a good idea to do that. But if that's not feasible, to at least acknowledge explicitly, we are working on the assumption that X. And it might be that you have to continue to make that known, but you might not be able to validate or invalidate that assumption as part of a given session. So it's important to clarify or to put that context on any of the insights that come out of the work. Same thing with a hypothesis. My background's actually in science. I was a physics teacher for several years. So when people talk about hypotheses, I'm like, yes, you can't do any type of experiment or any type of research without having a hypothesis. But I say that with a very giant asterisk on it, because there's a difference between having a hypothesis and having a preconceived notion or a solution idea that's going to unconsciously, if not consciously, guide what you end up doing and what you learn from your research. So careful when you think about a hypothesis. It's more about the question we're trying to answer, and maybe you think you have an idea of the why, but you've got to be open about it if it's not what is actually the case. And then finally, choosing the activities. So what we just did now was not getting into the activities yet. It was just thinking about the first couple of these, right? Thinking about challenges and goals, questions, things we're trying to understand more about and what we're trying to achieve. We also didn't today explicitly talk about our users, and that's because of the nature of today's workshop. We really can't get into that. But when we talk about those three that you guys just voted on, you know, we might be able to think a little bit more about it. Who are those folks? Who are the people that would be involved in that, in the co-creation of that type of work, etc. I do want to spend a little bit of time zoomed in on that last one about activities, because this is where I do get lots and lots of questions. And I think one thing people really want out of this, and unfortunately it's just not there to be given, is like a cheat sheet or a menu of activities. There are a lot of books out there that have fantastic, long lists of different types of activities that you can do. Research activities, workshop activities. They're great. Buy them, use them. I have a few. I can post a list, or I'll add a slide with a few of those. I'm just realizing right now I don't have that slide in this deck, but really I don't look to books for like the menu of things to choose from. I let the question I'm trying to solve guide me. And then I think about what type of activities we can use to achieve those. And I tend to think about them in a number of categories, if that helps. So one category of activity is trust building. When I want to get people together, or I keep saying together, but in COVID times, we might not do this together, and that's okay. But what I want to do is think about how to build trust with the participants so that they are willing to share their expertise in their own life with me. So sometimes activities are really just focused on building that trust, having them share something, having me share with them, having other participants share with each other. Then also there are these collaboration activities where we're trying to build on the synergy between people to build something or to understand something greater than we would if they were individual. So any type of activity that might involve people problem solving or generating solution ideas, but together as a group, would fall into that category. Narrative activities are the ones that really get us to understand how someone's life or experience has gone, or where there are challenges or where there are highs and lows. So it's our way of understanding that really unspoken kind of latent level of knowledge that, again, is hard to get from just asking or even observing. Some of these activities get at something deeper. Same thing I've talked about now a couple of times, generative activities. This is where we have people make stuff. In a nutshell, we have them make something. And then reflective activities are a little bit more about reflecting on something or evaluating something or maybe prioritizing things. So I'll talk a little bit more about those. And this is just how I think about it. I've learned this from a number of folks over the years, so I didn't make these categories up and they're not set in stone, but it's sort of how when I'm planning a session, I'm thinking through, am I going to have an activity from each of these? Or, not always. Sometimes I just do a couple. The three that I actually almost always include are the last three. So the best that I can, I try to include an activity that is a narrative type of activity, and then a generative activity, and then a reflective activity. Sometimes some activities kind of accomplish multiple things. So none of this is really that black and white. But I do want to just talk briefly about those three I mentioned in a little more detail. For those of you who are totally new to this, this is something you're like, well, I don't even know what any of these activities are. So let me give you an example. Narrative activities are the kind that help us understand participants' needs via storytelling. So they're the types of things that are intended to elicit memories, help build up empathy and understanding, building trust, etc. These activities can sometimes kind of do multiple things, can help build trust. If you start with one of these, then you can kind of get like 2 for 1 or 3 for 1. And I did just see a quick question about, are these done easily remotely? Some more than others. I have a little bit of that in a couple slides later on about how to convert some of these to work more easily via remote than others. But yes, a lot of these, with a little creativity, you can do a lot of things remotely. Some examples of narrative activities would be things like journey mapping, which I mentioned earlier. We often think about as the journey maps that we build internally to represent something versus having somebody create a journey map of their own experience. So we've done things where we give them a blank canvas with maybe a road or some kind of path on it. And we give them, basically the ability to show what are the key milestones for them or what are the key moments. And then to indicate extra layers of information via emoji stickers or thumbs up or thumbs down or thought bubbles, essentially having them build journey maps the same way that we do as designers. Sometimes we also do that as a group activity as well as an individual activity, and you can learn a lot of interesting things that way. There's another activity that we do a lot called the love letter or breakup letter, where we ask people to write either a love letter or breakup letter, maybe their choice or maybe whichever, hybrid, directed at something, and not just humans. So not just write a love letter to like the customer service rep that helped you through this problem, but also write a love letter or breakup letter to your bank, or write a love letter or breakup letter to your mental health, so you can get a little abstract with this. And it's nice because you can use it if you ask somebody to write it directed at an organization or a company. It helps understand a deeper level of what the brand means to them. But also you can have them write something that tells you more about how an experience went for them. And it's interesting to hear because given the choice, people almost always write kind of a hybrid. They'll say, dear so-and-so, here are all the things I love about you, but here's why it's not working out and we have to break up, or vice versa. It's like, here are all the things that frustrate me about you, but at the end of the day, I'm glad we're together, and it's helpful to get the nuance that you might not get from a more straightforward type of activity or question on a survey or interview. Collaging can serve this purpose as well, where you give people a number of stock images. And I love this activity. This is not special to participatory design. Like this can happen in interviews and so forth. But essentially, it becomes participatory when you use the collaging activity to understand what somebody would improve about their experience. So you have to have people make the collage in response to a prompt. And we're going to do that in our next activity together here. And that means the prompts have to be carefully written. And I'll talk a little bit about that. Empathy mapping, same idea. We often do empathy mapping as a way for us building empathy for our users, but having a human actually build the empathy map for themselves. What am I seeing? What am I hearing? What am I feeling? It's maybe not an empathy map anymore. It's something else. It's just a personal map. But having these folks do these types of activities, creating the artifacts that we often use, but creating them for themselves can teach you a lot. And then things like reenacting or acting out scenarios, those kind of like skits or sketches that people might do, depending on who your crowd is in a session or an interview, et cetera. We'll be able to kind of act out how things have gone. There's another activity we've done a lot of lately called circles of me, or it's like influence mapping, or basically having people create a bullseye or a map of what is most important to them, right? With like the core and then some concentric circles and what lives in those circles. Could be humans, could be objects, could be organizations. You can define that. You can say, build the circles of you related to healthcare. Who are the most important people in your life related to your health, or et cetera. So you can be very creative and flexible about how you prompt people to engage in these activities. And these are just some examples. So I mentioned collaging. This is actually the thing we're going to do in Mural momentarily in a little, hopefully we'll see how it works. I'm curious. It's an experiment for me as well. But with with collaging, honestly, guys, the worst part about collaging is cutting out all the images. And if you don't have them, sourcing them can be a pain. Lucky for you all, I actually have a couple files with like a bunch of these collage images. They're just tons of stock photography. I'm actually in the process right now because I want to review them there's lots of quote diversity in a lot of these images, but I'm not all that happy with what's in some of them. So that's based on like a lot of things that are going on in the world. It has me rethinking and reflecting on what we have in some of these images, but they're meant to be abstract. So there aren't tons of people in them. There are a lot more objects and animals and kind of just abstract imagery and words. And I have actually made this point a couple of times when people ask, why do you bother with the words? If you are having someone make a collage on a blank canvas, it can look really different, right? This person created on the bottom right, this kind of grid, and this person on the top right started showing relationships without even being asked. And sometimes it's just a total like googly gobbly mess, and that's great. But if there's something there that somebody wants to add, or if they're a verbal person, telling them to just put it on a Post-it or add it with a pen doesn't activate the same thing as picking up the word that's been cut out. And I don't know why. I wish I could tell you. I don't know if it's a psychology thing that I'm not aware of, but when people pick up the words that have been cut out, there's a different kind of activation for what they're talking about. And sometimes they'll pick up a word that's close to what they want, but not quite, or it jars something for them. And then when they talk about this and they explain what they've done, you can really see the difference. So I'm always inclined to provide way more than what they need than to just give them like 5 images and a couple words. The other thing is though, if you give them too much, then they spend forever like rooting through the pictures. It's almost like, choice paralysis. So there's a nice balance to strike. This pile on this table was for use of among like 5 people. So I would cut that in half, or maybe even a third if you were going to do it with just, 1 or 2 people. I can share the files that I have that are basically PDFs with a bunch of these images, and the only thing you have to do to use them is give your hand cramps cutting them, or make the interns do it. Here's some empathy maps that we've done, and you can combine them with images. We don't always do this, but a couple of these are from an activity where we actually let people fill out their empathy maps with collage images, because they're a little bit more abstract and easier to demonstrate emotions. So let me talk about generative activities. This is the one that people always love to hear about because you make these cool objects, but it's not the only thing. So these are the types of activities where participants generate ideas and can actually create prototypes of products or services or experiences. Sometimes they're, as I mentioned earlier, actually creating viable solution concepts. Sometimes they're really just creating things that are high-level abstract-y stuff that give us insight and direction and kind of tell us where to go next. So, and that does depend on both when you're doing it in the design process. It also depends on what the topic is. It also depends on who the users are. If you're working with a bunch of carpenters and you're asking them to build a prototype out of wood, they might be able to build you something pretty damn close to the right thing. But for most people, we're talking about building things that they really don't have the training or the vocabulary to do. So it's more on the abstract characteristics or features end of something, and not a viable actual solution concept. But some examples of these activities include having people create a magic screen or a magic button or a magic object. I do this almost every time I do participatory design. Not every time, but almost every time, because having somebody make a thing is just magic. And it's, they're definitely the people that are going to grumble, and they're going to be like, I'm not going to play with pipe cleaners. What is this stupid thing? And you just kind of chat with them. If they're really adamant and stubborn and they like have no intention of engaging at all, you can just talk to them then. Be like, well, what is it? What are the things you would want? What object do you need? Almost every time I've ever encountered people that are like reluctant to play with stuff, 5 or 10 minutes in, there's music playing, if it's a group session in a room together, or, as part of whatever's going on conversationally, it's relaxed. People just pick something up in their hands and they start playing, and they start like bending a pipe cleaner, and then suddenly they're making something. So it just takes time for some folks. Others, they jump right in. They're super psyched. They want to play like it's kindergarten again. But you can change up how that goes depending on what type of materials you use. But essentially what it boils down to is you give them a prompt and say, based on what we've talked about today or what topic we're here to discuss, I would love for you to design a magic object that helps solve all of your problems related to X, or something along those lines. And you give them time to put a thing together. And again, I hate to say it because the objects are amazing to look at, but the objects don't matter. It's not what the object does or looks like at all. It's what it does, how it does it, how it solves their problem. So again, I always make sure that, most importantly, there's time to ask, what does that do? How does it help you? And I always emphasize to folks, you don't have to worry about it being realistic. Don't worry about if the technology is out there for it. You don't have to be an engineer. You don't have to be a designer. Don't worry about if it's feasible. Blue sky, fantasy world, magic. There's a reason we call it magic. And that's when they kind of relax and they don't worry about, well, it's going to be an Alexa that does this, or it's going to be a screen that does that. It becomes like a pipe cleaner thing that does something magical. And whatever it does, or whatever problem it solves, tells us where we need to focus. And a lot of times it generates ideas that we might not have realized were going to be useful or viable for folks. You can also have people do actual prototyping. So this goes just a little bit further in the direction of reality. So it's not a magic object now. It's, here's some stuff, design a real solution. And depending on who you have in the room, they might actually be in a place to do that. The nurses example is a good one. Having the nurses design their own workstation. They really are doing some paper prototyping or something equivalent of that. They're not really designing a fantasy scenario. They're really co-designing their future workspace. Things like Mad Libs or fill in the blank I mentioned earlier is a way to generate new connections between concepts. So giving people that kind of, a blank is like a blank because blank, and you can use that in a lot of ways, very flexible. Ideal workflow mapping. So having people just on a canvas of some kind actually describe what they're doing and change that. It's not unrelated to journey mapping, except it's based more on tasks and workflows. Ecosystem or influence mapping. This is also not that different from like the circles of me activity, but if it's pivoted or prompted in a way that's more about generating new concepts or identifying what a new or future or potential version would be. So these can take lots of forms. These are just some shots of magic object activity from, oh boy, years ago now. And you can see the difference, right? This one on the top left, I think, was essentially a magic thing that would help answer this person's questions. This was before Alexa existed. So, you know, this was basically saying, I want that. One on the bottom right, I really love, because this was way back before there was a lot of more advanced medicine. But this person basically said, I want to swallow a pill and just have it magically know if there's anything wrong with my body at any time. This device will just blink red or green, depending on if I'm good or not. And that's not that far away from some of the technology that's out there right now. These are some other magic objects. This was related to billing process for users. So this was like a button that said press in case of billing frustration. This is funny. It makes me laugh. Obviously, as an object, this tells me nothing. So this is not where the insights come from. But asking the person, okay, what does it do? What happens when you press it? When would you press it? And what happens once you press it? That's where the magic comes. And that's where we would capture what they have to say and we learn from. These are just one of my favorite objects of all time. So reflective activities, I will talk through, and then I'll check to see the chat if there's questions. So reflective activities are the kind where people are trying to make judgments on things or reflect on things, make connections, etc. Help us understand the value of the solutions we might have in mind. This is good activities to include if you already have some hypotheses or some even potential solution concepts. So if this is like a little later in the design process where you might have some things you actually almost want to test, but still room for co-creation of new things. So some types of these activities might be card sorting, and you're thinking card sorting, that's not what, no. Yeah, watch somebody actually do a card sorting activity live in person rather than using an online tool. Watch them like hem and haw over where they put something. You can do card sorting via all kinds of amazing tools. If you're just trying to design the right IA for a website, you can use optimal sort. What you get is kind of the final result. But if you're doing card sorting in a little bit more abstract way and you do it in person where someone physically places cards, you learn a whole lot from watching how long it takes them to place one of them that you don't get if you just look at the end result of the card sort. Value ranking, very similar, putting things in sort of rank and order based on value that things provide. Storyboard or concept speed dating. So if you have concepts that you already have, this could be stuff that you bring into the session, or it even could be concepts that come from previous activities in the session. Doing a speed dating kind of process with those. If you're not familiar with speed dating as a research concept, it's basically where you give somebody a couple minutes, you describe a thing or you have them read a vignette. And then you basically kind of just ask them like a question, what do you think about that? You do that for a couple things relatively quickly. And then at the end of the quote speed dating session, you know, you ask like, which one would you go on a date with, or which one would you want to see more about? Body storming and game storming. So having people engage physically and acting things out. It's related to like the skits or the reenactments from the narrative part of this work, but now is more about kind of acting out how something would go and figuring out if it makes sense. A 2x2 matrix, I'm a sucker for 2x2 matrices. I love this activity. I do it almost all the time. And you know, what's on the axes depends on every different type of workshop you're doing, but let me skip ahead real quick to show you one. So this was one where, gosh, I don't even remember if this was related to health, but you can see the axes here are from relief to frustration and then least important and most important. And it was a number of, oh yeah, it looks like it's a lot of health terms. So things like diagnosis, nutrition, PPO, like all kinds of health terms. And in this case, I think we were trying to understand where these concepts lived for people in terms of whether they represented a good, you know, relief, or if they represented frustration and complexity, and then whether they were very important or not important to them. So this was like a more abstract type of use for this activity. You could also put features from an app in here and have people essentially tell you, well, these features are super important or not that important, and then, you know, tell you if they're good or bad. I mean, what goes on each axis depends again on what you're trying to study and understand. So I'm a big fan of those. So before we get into the next activity where we're going to turn those how might we's into prompts, let me check real quick on our questions. How long do you need for an activity like this? Have you ever had one that really bombed? What should we not do? I might save that for the end. I usually give folks 20 to 40 minutes for most of these activities, just as a ballpark, but you can flex that. And I've actually had exciting good luck with actually shorter time frames, doing them remote via one-on-one. It takes people more time when they're in a group because they kind of relax and talk to each other, and you want to give ample time. I usually do these, if I do them as a group workshop, as a half-day workshop, you know, 3 or 4 hours for 3 or 4 activities, just to have time to talk in between and stuff like that. I'll talk about like when they bomb. They don't. You have to just be flexible and you can pivot what happens. But generally nobody ever just like doesn't engage. And if you have to redirect people on the fly or maybe change up the nature of an activity, you do. But I'll have more to say about it at the end. If I don't get back to that and I forget and you want to hear me talk about it more, just remind me. How much time relative to making do you spend debriefing? So meaning after the fact. I have that later, but in short, for about every hour you spend in the actual session, you probably want to plan for 2 to 3 hours after the work, like with your team internally afterwards, debriefing and analyzing and so forth. That's ideal. You know, you can get away with less, but if you do like a full day, you know, 2 half-day sessions of participatory design work, I would plan for 2 to 3 days to analyze. And that's if you really can dedicate the full time of a day, you know, to do it. In addition to Liz Sanders, what are your best references? That one I can follow up with later. Really, her work is like the best, and there's not a lot of resources beyond hers, which are mostly philosophical. Will we have access to these activity resources in PowerPoint? I will share the slides, yes. And back to resources, the challenge is that there are a lot of folks that are kind of doing this work and figuring it out as they go, but I don't see a lot of people talking or sharing about it. There are good books that have lists of activities I mentioned earlier. I will add that slide to this deck when I share the slides. I don't know why I left it out of this one, it was an accident. How do you navigate tension between stakeholders? Ooh, that's a good one. Depending on who's in the group, you can avoid that. If you're gonna do a session with all customers or end users, you know, bank users or health insurance members, you won't get that too much. You have to plan carefully to do some trust building and ease your way in and make sure everybody feels comfortable, but you don't usually get that. Tension comes when you've got like doctors and patients in the same room and it's a topic that's maybe contentious because patients are mad because they had bad experiences and doctors are defensive, and because patients don't understand what their life is like. Those can be both amazing and terrible, and you've got to think about what you're trying to achieve. There's a lot of value to be had from having them in the room together and have patients go, oh my God, I never realized that for doctors and nurses, your life was this crazy, and that the reason my visit is so harried is because you have all this stuff going on behind the scenes that I don't know about. And doctors are going to say, God, I just really never have a chance to sit down and think what it's like to be in your shoes. I'm too busy running from appointment to appointment and banging my head against Epic and other EHRs. So there's value to be had there, but you have to plan it. And then the other way that you avoid the tension is good facilitation. You're an active facilitator of the conversation and you redirect people when energy goes that way. So some of it's just part of practice. And sometimes if you don't feel confident that that can be avoided and it won't be constructive, then you do them separately. Asking cues about what was made. Let me go back. Sorry, you guys kind of staring at me while I look at the chat. Becca, your question is,
I can just try to ask.
yes, it's complicated to read. Ask me
yeah,
out loud.
I realize, yes. I've found that, right, people do get into the making and having lots of fun, and then I find I'm worried about being shortchanged on the understanding why they made something, which is the important part, as you said. So I'm wondering what you find is the right balance of time for that, or like how you ensure that you learn as much from what they create as you can in the time that you have with them. Yeah,
I tend to bias. So I know you guys are going to hate this answer, but a lot of that just comes with some practice and experience, and you kind of get a sense for it. You know, pilot some of these with your coworkers or with friends to get a hang of it too. But I find that I always bias towards more time for conversation and sharing if I have to. I will cut an activity short to be able to have the time to talk about it, because having the object without the info about it is almost useless. Whereas having a half-started object, but then not finished, but the person can tell me what it was going to do or how it works is much better. In fact, one time we were doing a participatory design session with folks in South Carolina. It was elderly and some differently abled folks. And we were at a community center, and then it started to rain very heavily and there was a flash flood warning. And because they weren't confident that everybody would be able to get out in time, they actually evacuated the community center when we were like 2/3 of the way through the session. And that was a scenario where we had only gotten like 5 minutes into the magic object activity. And while we were waiting for the buses to come to take folks back, like various vans, mobility vans and so forth, we just chatted with people very casually. And I was worried we were just going to get nothing out of the magic object activity, which would have been fine because that happens. But ultimately having like 5 minutes of just casual chat about what were you going to make? And then, you know, oh, I was going to make this object that was like, it's not as good, but it's better. So I always err on the side of more time for talking and asking questions and sharing. And I have a slide I'll talk through later. How you actually get the info about their stuff is different for people and can be flexible. So sometimes it's literally asking everybody to share, like show and tell. Sometimes it's just sitting next to them if you're in person, casually asking them like while they're building, what are you making? How's it going to work? You know, and there's a lot of in between. So I will talk through that a little bit more as well. When I say 20 to 40 minutes activity time, does that include debrief time? No, this is why it's kind of flexible. I guess it just depends on the number of people that you're in a session with. Right now, if you're doing it remotely, you might have, you know, 1, 2, or 3 people. I usually probably wouldn't say to do it with more if you're doing it remote, because Dan makes the same point right before that. You might do an in-person session for a half day. Having people sit on Zoom for that long is not good. Nope, don't do it. We've done a couple sessions now where we do a Zoom meeting for 2 hours. That's doable. 2 hours is tolerable. And so in that case, you might even consider breaking it up and doing like part 1 of a session, and then a couple of days later do a part 2. So maybe do 2 hours on one day, and then like maybe 1 hour for some follow-up and another activity or something with some homework in between, which I'll talk about. But 2 hours is doable on a Zoom session, but that means you don't have a ton of time to talk to like 8 people. So I would limit that to like 3. And in that case, you know, you can probably manage. But generally, I'll just say on average, if I think through it, we usually are looking at 3 to 4 hours total to achieve 3 or 4 activities. So I'm probably giving, when I include the making time, the instruction time, and then time for asking questions, and then getting people to share their stories, probably an hour for that, all of that for one activity. And some activities go a lot faster, like a love letter activity. They write the letter in 5 minutes, they read them, talk for another couple, it's like 20 minutes. Maybe half hour, versus a magic object, you give them more time because they're making stuff. Cool. I think I touched on a lot of these. I know I didn't go deep into some because I know there are some slides later that are going to get to them, but then if after that there's more that I haven't answered, bring it back and we'll talk about it towards the end. Do you approach things differently if you have a cohort you're working with over multiple sessions versus a one? Yeah, I do. We don't get to do as many repeated group interactions just because of the way that we tend to work on the projects with our clients. A lot of times they don't have a group that they can work with over the long term, over the course of a design process. That's not true for everybody, but it just seems like it's more common for a lot of the projects I've worked on over the last few years. That's great though, because then you can check in with people along the way and you can bring things to them and evaluate things with them. It doesn't radically change the approach. I mean, the whole point is to be engaging these folks in the co-design process. So earlier on, it's more of the abstract envisioning and generative and making. But later on, you can bring some of those ideas. You might not be spending as much time on the narrative or generative activities, and you might be doing more of those types of reflective kind of evaluating activities. And those might not look and feel very different from the other types of research you already do. Maybe they're not. You know, is usability testing co-design? You could argue it is. I mean, we could have a philosophical debate about it, but I think it has a lot to do with whether you are engaging with folks as test subjects or as co-creators. So if you're going to bring something that is later in a process, if that same group helped generate the ideas that led to some solution concepts and you bring them back for a session, at that point, you want to reflect back. What we heard from you guys led to this. Here are our solution concepts. We want to both evaluate these with you. We also want you to be co-creators so you can continue to generate new versions or revisions to this rather than just, do you know where to click? Is this desirable, etc. So it's more about how you would approach the work, but I wouldn't radically change the approach from the logistics and planning session, just from the mindset and what you're using the sessions for. These are such good questions. I love it. Okay, let me pause there. Let's go back to the design prompts, because what we're going to try now is give you guys a teeny bit of practice with this. This is hard. If you're a person that does research all day long, maybe it's not that hard for you because this is how you have to think. But this is hard for people to get the hang of if they don't do this regularly. And when I do this in a long, day-long workshop, I will actually have people write these prompts. I'll have them do activities with the prompts. And I intentionally will not correct people if they make their prompts too high level or too broad, or if they make them way too narrow. And I will intentionally let them use prompts that are kind of bad, because then when they go to actually do the activities, they can see, oh, this was really hard for me to do because it was so broad. And then you kind of get the hang of like where it needs to be in that sweet spot. It's hard to do that in this format right now. So instead of being able to do that, I'm going to just tell you that's the hard part, is making sure your prompts are specific enough that people can engage with them, but not too specific so that you're really kind of biasing them towards some kind of solution or an output. So the design prompt sets the stage, ensures that participants are going to be able to focus their contributions on the things that you're actually trying to achieve. And so this is like kind of the level of what they should be. Use the items provided to create a perfect remote control. Draw an imaginary classroom that provides all your educational needs. Create a script for the ideal interaction between a patient and a doctor. Build a collage that best represents how you feel about your retirement savings. So these are appropriately specific. They're not too broad. It's not how do you feel about money, but it's not too specific. Like, how do you feel about your 401k or whatever, you know, or your contribution level, you know, that kind of thing. So like I said, this just takes practice, and you can kind of figure out if you've got it right if you try to pilot it with somebody. And over time, you end up not having to even do that because you kind of have a good knack for it. So let's try this. What we're going to do is we're going to go back to the mural, and we're going to revisit the problem statements. The 3 that you guys gave that you voted on, I think are going to be great. So we're going to take those statements and we're going to try to turn those into prompts. And what are we doing the prompt for? What type of activity? Let's do it for a collage. So we're all going to basically pretend that we're planning a participatory design session around the topic that is one of the 3. So you'll basically pick one to focus on, or you can do one for each of the 3 if you want. But basically, I'm going to take those Post-its and move them into the boxes shortly. So we're going to do a participatory design session focused on the topic at hand. And then within that, one of the activities is going to be a collage activity. And we're going to write the design prompt for that collage activity. And then we'll end up using that. There's not necessarily, there's a lot of different ways you could go with this. So for example, let me go ahead and switch over to just look at the mural really quick. One of the ideas that we voted on was how might we improve financial education for minority groups, okay? So within that, to say that's the broad topic for our whole participatory design session, if I'm going to do a collage, it could be a lot of things. If the session was actually with minority group participants, the collage might be, build a collage that tells me how you have felt about your education or your financial literacy. Or it could be something totally different. It could be build a collage that describes how you feel about how what your parents taught you about money. So there's like kind of different like ways you could go and explore. I just want to give you guys a chance to think about turning the broad topic into a specific prompt for a specific activity. So that's what we'll do momentarily. But before you start, let me go back to the PowerPoint real quick. What I'm going to have you do is, again, think about the topic. Again, that's the Post-it that we brought over from the previous section. That's the broad topic. And then you're going to write a design prompt for a collage activity. I don't think we'll bother voting on this. I think I'll just pick one just in the interest of time now that we know how to vote and it worked well. And then we're going to actually try the collaging activity momentarily after that. But I also wanted to give you guys just a quick description of like a collage activity, the way that I would explain it to participants as well, because it might help you in thinking about the design prompt. And there are a couple examples here at the bottom about what some of those design prompts might be. So what does the healthcare landscape look like to you right now? What does planning for retirement feel like to you? Those are examples of prompts for a specific activity like collaging. And as an FYI, if I was presenting collage activities, like this is kind of the background, right? So this activity helps members express their experiences and needs in a way that words can sometimes fail. Participants will also put themselves at the center of the map, which I don't always do, but like in this case, you know, let's say you're at the center and then it's about how these things relate to you, which allows us to understand how members conceive of their own agency or lack thereof in that process. How you would do this, participants would be provided a prompt, which we're going to write now, and asked to create a collage that describes their feelings and experiences about that prompt. Participants are then asked to share and discuss their collage, and facilitators may ask participants to elaborate a little bit. And usually the materials would be things like paper or glue, etc. If you're going to do this remotely, you could use Mural and have your users use Mural to do it the way that we're going to try later. But I don't know. I have yet to try that. I think it depends on the tech savvy of your users. But I'll talk a little bit about that momentarily. However, let's go back to the mural and let's get that started. So let me share the mural. Okay, hopefully you guys see my mural board, and I've unlocked this section. So what I'm going to do really quick is put each of these problem statements near one of the boxes, and you can pick one to focus on, or take a look and do all three if you want. But for each of these, try to write a prompt that would be used for a collaging activity. And while you're doing that, let me know if anybody runs into any tech problems. Generally, so far, most of these questions I think have a lot to do with like timing and how long and how much time for doing versus listening versus etc. And I know it's the most frustrating thing of all, but really the answer to that is you have to be flexible, and you will absolutely change something on the fly. So it's less about having it down to the, I know this takes an hour. It's more about knowing you have these activities, you're trying to achieve these goals. If something isn't working in the moment because it's taking too long, you can pivot what you're trying to do as long as it's still in the service of understanding the thing you're trying to understand. And I will talk momentarily about like how I get people to share, but for time being, I'll let you guys focus on writing prompts. And I mentioned this earlier, but if this is causing any level of cognitive consternation, we did not talk about the user group, right? Because again, we're sort of brainstorming this for the act of flexing the muscles and seeing how it works. It's not a realistic scenario because we didn't talk about who are the people that we're going to be doing this research with. So for the elementary education, right, that could include parents, that could include students, that could include administrators, community members, teachers. Some of these prompts might be directed at students. Some of these prompts might be directed at teachers, right? So it's totally fine to just pick one and write in that way just to get the practice. And then similarly with the financial education and healthcare, there's a number of different individual groups that could be part of that you could have together in the room, or you could have separate, and therefore the prompts might be different. And I will touch just more on the question about having different stakeholders in the room. Because the attention question is a good one, and I hadn't thought about that a whole lot, but I get lots of questions about just generally, do you put different groups together? And it's a total non-answer, but it really depends. There are definitely times where having different groups together is fantastic, and it does help build empathy, and it helps uncover some things and build some synergy as groups talk to each other about what they're making and why. Other times, having patients and doctors or having different folks, different power structures, different roles together in the room isn't going to do much beyond maybe build some empathy, but isn't going to necessarily generate any additional insights, in which case logistically it might make more sense to just do sessions with one group and then sessions with another group if you want to get both perspectives. They don't necessarily have to be together, and both have been successful for me. All right, let's wrap this part up. If you're still writing a post-it, let's make that your last post-it. And instead of voting, I was wondering maybe what would be helpful. What I'm going to do, if this works, if I can zoom in a little more, to help you guys understand what I think makes for a good level of specificity, I might just go through these and like touch on a few of them. Hopefully you can separate any sense of personal identity tied up in any of these, so that if I say this one's too broad and this one's too specific, don't take it personally. We're all learning, right? I had to learn the hard way myself. But I'm going to go through a couple of these and just try to like call out which ones I think are a good representation of specificity, or maybe they all are. Maybe you guys have nailed it. So let's wrap that up. If you're still writing a post-it, go ahead and stop. And then if you haven't, come back over to the mural. To the Zoom. Come over to the Zoom. And I am screen sharing the mural. So hopefully you can see, even if you can't read, I'll read them. But if you can see the Zoom screen share, I'm gonna move around and look at some of these and just comment briefly on a few to help understand where we're going. So there's one here. What would an equitable elementary education during COVID look like? So like assuming that would be like build a collage that shows what that would look like. I think that's a good one. I would actually be fascinated to see what that would produce. And I think that would be interesting to see if a parent made one versus a teacher versus a student, right? How might we provide more resources for our elementary education immediately? So this one is more of a, as you can see, it's a how might we statement. So this is actually more of a problem statement that we're trying to solve overall, but this would not really work well as a prompt for a collage, mainly because a person who's looking at this is going to say, okay, but what do I do with these pictures that I'm holding in my hand? And what do I do with this glue stick? And they might feel like you're asking me to solve that. Jesus, I don't know. So I would adjust this to be more like build a collage that represents what it would look like to have more resources, or what would having more, you know, basically focusing on the resources part of this, which is kind of what makes it key. And it's about building or make a thing that represents how resources matter in education, something like that. This, as it's written, is a little bit more of like a solution concept. And this might, you know, kind of build into something you might say, build a magic object that would help achieve that, something like that. Depict what elementary education has felt like to you. It's a good one. Create a collage depicting what it's like to learn from home. Good one. A lot of these that are like what it feels like to do something are always usually on the right track. Represents your hopes and fears about sending your kids back to school. Good. Create a collage that represents what an ideal homeschooling environment would look like. Yeah, it would be interesting to see. In fact, that might even be one that you could give people more of like, not just collage images, but could almost end up being like a layout. You know, they could almost end up making a blueprint. Role play scenarios for different kinds of constraints and personas, and they experience education. So this wouldn't be in the development of a persona or a collage, but I'm reading this as perhaps this person wrote this thinking this might be a prompt for a different type of activity. So not a collage activity, but a different activity, which is fine. My instructions might not have been super clear. I was hoping for us to do collage specifically, but this is good if you were going to do a different activity, role play a couple scenarios. If you were going to do this and ask participants to actually do some role playing of those scenarios, I might take the time to actually either suggest or brainstorm scenarios first. So you're not asking them to both think of the scenario and then think of the role play. You might either want to give them the scenarios and ask them, or take a moment in a separate pre-activity to, as a group, come up with some of those scenarios first and then assign them. Looking good. What does a great day look like? These are pretty good. These are pretty darn good. None of the ones that I'm reading are really so terribly broad or so too specific. That I would think would be problematic. Some of them just are shifted a little bit away from like the actual collage activity. How do you wish you could learn about financial topics? This one's tough because, again, this is kind of asking somebody to just tell you a solution to something versus, you know, if this was for a collage, it would be maybe how do you feel when you are learning about financial topics, or build a collage that represents what learning about financial topics is like for you. So it's more about expressing what that experience is like and not tell me what you want. What format and tools would appeal to minority groups? Also similar. Get away from asking people to tell you solutions and get more towards paint me a picture of what it's like. Because we're going to listen for the solutions that are going to be reading between the lines when they tell us. These are good. Build a collage. Build a collage, depict what your life would look like. What does financial literacy look like? Depict money habits you're most proud of. Create a picture of how financial education might look. Yeah, the rest of these look pretty good. I think you guys have the hang of this. Shoot, you don't need me at all. Build a collage of social factors that influence your health. This is a good one, although you might have to be like, depending on the audience, you might have to be like social factors, like, you know, you might have to be a little more down to earth and explain what that means. Build a collage that represents how you feel about interacting with the healthcare system. I have literally used that exact prompt, which was very interesting results. As a provider, illustrate a case managing the health of a patient of color. This one would be interesting as a collage versus like actually giving them the ability to illustrate it in some other way. Maybe letting them sketch or adding other types. So if they didn't want to use pre-provided pictures and instead wanted to build something from scratch, that would be interesting. But that's a good one. Build a collage that represents the financial support experience for minorities in healthcare. This is good, except this one hits on something that I try to steer clear of, which is not asking people to represent their entire user group. Obviously, this is especially important when we're talking about folks that are in minority groups of any kind, not expecting them to represent their entire minority group. It's not a monolith, right? But that's also true even just for patients, like, or, you know, as a pregnant woman, what is your experience like blank? When you ask that, it's important to make clear that you're not asking somebody to represent an entire group, but if you say something like, as a pregnant woman, the reason you're saying that is we're curious about how your experience is impacted by the fact that you're pregnant. As a member of a minority group, we are very curious to understand what your experience has been like, including how it's been influenced by the fact that you are a member of minority group. So be careful in the way that you word this, because you are not ever really asking any individual to represent a whole group in any of the activities that you would do in a session like this. You might see those patterns emerge across participants, but that's on you, the designer, to see those patterns. It's never on the user to represent. And I don't think anybody would intend that, but the words can sometimes suggest it to people. What does it feel like? Describe how individuals interact with healthcare. Describe is tricky. I would use more of like visual words. So create the collage that shows, or depict or illustrate or whatever, but I think that would be right. And then how individuals interact with, I would change to how you interact with healthcare. Illustrate your parents' experience at the doctor. Yeah, these are good. Generally, you guys have the hang of this. Definitely much closer to what I think would be successful across the board compared to other folks that I've worked with in this way. So you absolutely have the hang of it. So that's awesome. And honestly, as I said, I know it's not the sexy part of this work, but the topic and the framing and the planning around it, if you do good here, you've done 90% of the work. Then the activities almost become like not important, because you can pivot or flex them in the moment if you need to, depending on what materials you have at hand, to know that you're going to still try to solve the how might we question. And these prompts help ensure that the activities are actually going to solve the problems you're trying to solve. So you guys have the hang of that. That's awesome. Let me go back to the PowerPoint. So join me back over in the Zoom, and let's talk about planning a little bit. This is where I'll get into some of the logistics. Again, I'm going to touch on this briefly. You guys asked a few questions already, and then I'll talk about what to do to make them work better remote. So when you're planning, obviously you want to think about where you're doing it. You know, a lot of people immediately just think about workshop and have a bunch of people together in a room. And we do that a lot at MadPow. We bring a lot of people together in different spaces, but it can be in an office, could be in schools and homes, outdoors, individually, or in groups. Could be in the context of something, if it's healthcare related, in the context of the doctor's office and in the waiting room, intercepts, etc. So just be thinking about what makes most sense location wise. And obviously during times like right now, might need to be 100% virtual, and you might need to recruit folks who are willing to do some of these activities in their own home and essentially engage with you via Zoom or WebEx or some other type of tool. And we're having some luck with that, so it's totally doable. You want to think about who and how many people are going to be involved. So this gets to some of the questions you guys asked. Are we doing a large group? Are we doing a small group? Are we doing an individual? It can have a lot to do with who the group is, how easy they are to recruit. Is it a sensitive topic where people are only going to want to share with you in a one-on-one setting, or is a group setting going to unlock some really interesting differences? And I've used synergies like 5 times this talk, so I'll say that again. And there's no easy answers to this. This is the kind of stuff that you and whoever is planning the session should be talking about with each other and saying, what's going to make the most sense here? What do we think will uncover what we need? What's going to make people feel most at ease, etc. Observation methods, obviously taking tons of notes. If you can take photo and video, it's always good. It's not always available, but obviously the most types of information that you can gather, the better. And in virtual times, if you're doing things remotely, we've had people essentially build something and hold it up to the webcam and then take a screenshot, but it's obviously never very high res. So we then also ask them to take photos of it with their phone and email it or text us to us later. So we have it for later reference. As I said, it's not that big a deal because it's really what they say about it that matters more than the actual thing, but we still want to have a nice visual of it for, you know, to refer back to, etc. And then what type of materials will you need to have on hand if you're in person or if you're going to send materials to people? So things like construction kits, Legos, Play-Doh. I go to Michael's and just buy those like big old crafting kind of kits that have just a bunch of random stuff in them, pipe cleaners and little like foam shapes and googly eyes and feathers and stuff. There's a lot of good stuff in the scrapbooking aisle that you can buy, like little sticky, like gems that are like stickers. People like, to put those on things. So just buy a bunch of crap and people will make stuff out of it. And that's the key, is that it doesn't need to be that specific. Lego makes kits for this purpose. I don't even know what they charge for them, but I assume a lot. Maybe not, but it's great, especially if you want to have the Lego name on it, and maybe you're working with people that might be reluctant to pick up and play with construction paper, but maybe they'll play with Legos. But anything to construct anything with is good. You need, glue and tape and things like that. So be sure to think about all that. And then in terms of some of the other logistics, like any type of research recruiting, you got to give yourself 2 weeks to recruit people, maybe more depending on the scenario. Got to think about an honorarium, who are going to be your note takers, generally having one main facilitator and then whatever number of additional note takers and helpers is a luxury. So the more the better. And then if you're going to be mailing things, it's another thing to think about. So we've been doing that where we plan these sessions out and then we mail a little kit to people. And part of that might include some pre-work, or it's just having the materials at hand, which I'll talk about momentarily. But when you think about materials, it also, you can be as simple or as complex as you want. Something like this would require a poster board or a blank canvas. It requires those cutout pictures and some markers or writing utensils. Sometimes all you need are Post-its. Sometimes you need a whole bunch of junk, like this was balloons and stickers and pipe cleaners and little feather ball things. And so what you do is, what you have on hand will influence what gets made, but it's not always the most important part of the process. You can also make reusable kits. So I have not done this very often because more often than not, we want to keep the artifacts, at least for a short amount of time, rather than deconstruct them right away. But depending on your scenario, and or if you were, say, going to do this with a panel of folks on a regular basis, and once you've snapped a photo of an artifact, you could take it apart right away, you can actually build reusable versions of this. So like, if you can see here, those are shapes that are covered in felt, and then each of those little doodads has like Velcro on the back. So people can make something with Velcro, tell you what it does, then you can deconstruct it after they've left. Don't crush their feelings by destroying their artifacts while they were still with you. But then you can return them to their boards and reuse some of this stuff. You can also do that with collaging, by the way. You can create the image set and laminate them, and then people can like stick them on things. In that case, you can also get more quantitative if you number or code the images, and you can see like how many people choose which images, and maybe that tells you something about patterns or insights. I haven't done that too often because that need for quantitative level of insight is, it's hard to achieve that with this work, and qualitative research can be very rigorous. So I tend to not try to bend over backwards to turn qualitative into quantitative, but you can. So let's talk about remote and virtual, because I know this is on everyone's mind. And we've only been doing this now with some regularity for the last couple months. So this is new to us as well. There have been times in the past where people have asked me, as I mentioned earlier, could I send a kit to somebody far away and have them do it? I don't see why not, but I had not done it until early this year. And I know other people that had and had success with it, but now I can finally speak from experience. So first rule is keep it simple, okay? The less tech you're using, the better. Even though Mural is working for us today, I would actually probably recommend away from trying to have your users get into Mural, unless again, they're super tech savvy, or if your users or your participants are people that already work in those types of tools, then go nuts. You can do tons of amazing stuff with Mural or Miro or other similar tools. But for a lot of populations and a lot of the folks we're doing research with, just having them make sure they can do WebEx and are comfortable screen sharing and or using their webcam, that's already a tall task. So asking them to also use a tool like Mural just adds too much complexity. So keeping it very low tech is usually my recommendation. The design process also here, it really starts at recruitment. So make sure that you're screening for participants who have a webcam and will be comfortable turning on their cameras for you. It's important here more so than like maybe a one-on-one phone interview, because you want to be able to see people hold up and point at and refer to things that they've made. You want to share a one-pager summary with recruiters that outlines what's going to be expected of people. And then you're also going to provide that same type of instruction to the participants in advance. So be designing the participant experience from the beginning. And so that might include instructions for things like installing screen share software like Zoom or WebEx, You know, if you want to assign some pre-work, like you can have people write a love letter in advance. You can give them instructions for that and have them have it ready at hand when you start your session. So you can deal with the fact that you'll have less time with them if it's just a 2-hour Zoom call by having them do some thinking in advance. And obviously you just have to make sure you adjust the honorarium for that, that you account for time as it's being spent, even if it's not during the live session. You also want to think about an at-home experience. This is not a requirement by any means. You can definitely just get people on the phone and do some of this live together. Just know that it does, you know, it takes, the timing's a little different for people. But you can also do a lot at home by sending those kits in advance. So I'm really into this idea. We've found a lot of luck with this, with sending kits with physical materials, especially for generative activities like pipe cleaners and stuff. So you send a little individual kit with all those types of fun materials. And those are the things that they would be using if they were in person. And you can ask people to do some pre-work, you know, like write that love letter in advance, give them a blank sheet of paper with a little like dear, you know, and then a blank line and then blank paper to write on, send a blank sheet, send a writing utensil, give them everything. But then they've kind of got like a canvas on which to do some things if you want to have them do them in advance. You can have people make a magic object on their own in advance, but they might just not feel super confident in what they're doing. So when you get them on the phone or in the WebEx, you can expand on it a little bit and give them some more time to add stuff to it. I would also make sure you include something fun, like a snack, a little granola bar or a piece of candy or small toys. When we do these sessions live with people in person, we've always got like music in the background and snacks or coffee. So adding even just a flavor of that to a kit will help. We also have, at least in current times, made sure to indicate that everything was packed like it was clean, it was new out of a package. We wore gloves, you know, it's stuff that's needed to be sanitized or whatever has been sanitized. So just to put people at ease, if depending on populations that we're dealing with. I guess the way I would say this is design this process like you work for Disney and you're like sending those magic bracelets that we all see people reference when they want to talk about good service and experience design. This whole experience for the participants starts early, right? So design the whole thing, not just the session, but whatever arrives to the participant before that. And then this does go in line with what I was saying earlier, even if it's not remote, is you've got to be very flexible. So consider 2 shorter sessions with homework in between versus 1 longer session. One thing we've done lately is have a 2-hour session where we've done like a love letter activity and a magic object activity and a 2x2 matrix. Then we gave people homework to go and find a resource related to the thing that we were researching, anything they wanted. And then they brought it to the second session, like a show and tell. And we asked them, how did you find this thing? What did you search for? How did it go? How easily did you find it? What do you think about the thing you found? You may not like it. Why not? If you like it, what do you like about it? And then we also did some prompts where we asked them to take photos around their house of things that help them de-stress, or where they feel comfortable or where they feel bad. And that almost starts to border on the types of things you might have people do as part of a digital journal study, which totally intersects here. And that is one way that you might be able to gather things using digital journal platforms if you wanted to make use of that. We have not done that yet. Generally, we've had good luck with people just sending us via text or email pictures of what they do. Also consider one-on-ones. You know, you can get away with doing some of these as a one-on-one, and it doesn't have to be in person. I would say if you want to do them in person to gain some of that fun collaboration and crosstalk, I would really limit it to like 3 people, maybe 4. And yourself, and then you still need a note taker separate from the facilitator, because trying to run the facilitation on screen and then take notes is almost impossible. And then last but not least, plan for the worst. So we actually did this recently where we sent kits to people, and the very first session we did, nobody got their kit. And thankfully we thought through what we would do, which was, well, everybody should be able to get a pen and a piece of paper out of their house, right? Hopefully. And we did. So instead of the magic object, we had them draw. Again, I said earlier, I hate that. Blank paper makes people nervous, but we had no choice, and it went well. They were able to do it and really created some nice things. We had a 2x2 matrix. What we created was a PowerPoint slide that had the 2x2, and then we created a bunch of little cards in the PowerPoint with all the words that we were going to give them. In the kit, we had sent them a canvas and a bunch of little cutout words to put on the 2x2. So what we did was on screen, we just put the canvas up and then had them talk through where they would put them. And obviously that's not awesome, but it's better than nothing. And we were still able to get the insights from that activity, just not as efficiently as we would have done it if they had their kits with them. So here's a quick photo or 2 of some of these types of kits. Like identifying or separating out the different materials. So this is the stuff for the magic object. This is cards for the 2x2. We did an influence map where they were going to use emoji stickers to indicate emotions, instructions that are divided out by each activity and like a general intro letter. So you can see, you know, there's a lot here, and it's kind of fun to get one of these and open it up and get excited about what you're about to do. And it could include, in this case, each of these was in its own separate envelope, and we said, do not open any of these until the day of, but here is what you're going to be doing. You could also do one that was open up packet 1 and complete this activity prior to the session, and then wait for the rest of it for session 2. So whatever works. If you do Mural, you can do a lot of great stuff in Mural. This is from a workshop we did where we did have people get into Mural and building, you know, this was a journey map that already existed, and we were going to have people add information to it and stuff. So this is a much more tech savvy group of folks. And then I mentioned earlier about like homework, you know, having people take photos and send them to us, and then we compiled them together. So you can get a lot from people in their homes, taking pictures of things, creating things in front of themselves, and then sending them to you. So it's working pretty well. And I would say that the main headline of how to make it work virtually in the time of a global pandemic where everyone is going to be probably stuck at home for the foreseeable future, unless the rest of the country gets their act together. Design the remote participant experience as carefully and thoughtfully as you design any other user experience product or service. You can make it work, absolutely, but you've got to think through all of it, which means it takes some time and planning. So I also want to talk briefly about facilitating, and I'm going to just breeze through this pretty quick, and then hopefully we can get in and do the very last part in the mural. And actually, your guys have asked questions that have already talked through some of this, but for facilitating, this still applies as much remote as it does in person. Some of it's just different, but obviously being prepared is key. Like I mentioned earlier, having plans for the worst case scenario is going to be the thing that makes your life the best. Be yourself. I hear a lot of people talk a lot about like adopting a researcher kind of mode where you've got to be like super neutral, and that's important in some ways, to be neutral and to not have an overly dramatic response to things like, oh my God, you did what? But in this case, especially when you're going to engage with somebody over a couple hours, you do want to be human and you want to be yourself. You want to be genuine. You want to engage with folks. And I wouldn't go too far down the road of being kind of like a cold, objective observer. Just not go so far the other direction that you don't feel like you're not participating. You're a facilitator. So do be yourself. You got to be flexible and adaptive. I've talked through some of that. You've got to be reflective. And this is really hard because you've got to be reflective while you're also facilitating. So doing the actual facilitating is one like mind path. And then at the same time, reflecting on what you're hearing. I don't know about you, but I find that really hard because I do more of my reflecting and learning and seeing the patterns emerge afterwards when I've had time to let it incubate. But you have to try to do it a little in the moment, because as you learn things and patterns are starting to emerge in the moment, that might adjust how you want to facilitate the rest of the conversation and how you know what to ask when you're asking people to share. So you've got to be reflective at least a little bit while you are facilitating. And this goes back to the bit about don't be cold. We're not doing, you know, like one of those types of surveys you get accosted in the mall back ages ago to take a survey, and they just ask you this bunch of questions like they're a robot. You're not a robot, be a human. It helps a lot, especially in these sessions where you're asking people to do some things that might be outside their comfort zone. And then capturing value. Again, a few of you guys asked questions, so this helped, but definitely document everything as best you can. So you want to have dedicated note takers, the more the better. You want to try to take photographs of as much as you can. If you can record audio and visual, that's great. Keeping the artifacts at least for a little while. And then virtually, I have definitely been able to find that there's good luck with having people email or text photos of the stuff that they've made after the fact, after the session. So just so that you have photos of it for reference, and you can tie their quotes and things that they've told you during the session to those photos. And you really want to ask them to tell you what they created. I know I'm beating a dead horse, but this is the most important part of this. So there's a number of ways to do this. You can ask people to tell you what they've created one-on-one. Again, this is kind of like I might just go sit down next to somebody and very casually ask them. And you can make use of multiple facilitators in this part. So you might have one main facilitator, but you might have 3 people kind of doing this job. So you don't have to do every single person separately. You can have multiple people working on this at the same time and taking notes. But essentially, you can do it one-on-one, especially if it's maybe a sensitive thing or someone's a little reluctant or shy about sharing. You can do more of a show and tell where everybody gets a chance to share what they've made and others see and hear it. You can have people share a story about it, especially if they're like, what's that object you made? And they say, I don't know, it's just this. and they don't say anything else. And, they're a little bit tough to get information out of. Ask them to tell you a story about it. Tell me a story about a time where you would have really used that, or tell me a time when somebody could have really used that. And that's how you get them going, is to tell a story. You could also have them write a commercial about anything they create, especially a magic object, partly to tell you what it does, but also to kind of sell the value of it. And in that case, they are really pointing at the value proposition for you. So where they write that ad is like your value proposition. The only thing I would caution about is don't let it turn into like a hackathon. That kind of like competitive spirit ruins most of how this works. So it's not like you guys build a thing and then prove why it's the best. Nope. It's got to be all about why this thing is going to help you as an individual and not being compared to other things. Similarly with a pitch, you can turn it into a pitch, but keep it away from that competitive spirit. It's more like, here's why this is awesome for me. So as I've said before, I'll say again, what they create is way less important than how they describe its value. So I want to try, I know we only have a couple minutes. I'm kind of tempted to try this anyway, but give you guys like 2 minutes, and then maybe we should skip this if I want to give you guys time for questions, and you have a lot of questions. Let me do this. We're going to skip the last activity in the mural, but I want to show you what we were going to do, just to help you kind of understand what we were going to try. And I think probably you'll benefit a little bit more from me answering some questions. So in the mural, if I can get that to share. This last section, what I was going to do was have each of you guys essentially create a little collage. That was in one of these little canvases. So over on the right, there are like these gray areas. And I was going to say, take a little bit of time, grab a few images from somewhere and create a collage in response to one of these prompts. I think we're better off skipping that, but the point of that is for you to actually create the collage and then essentially think about what would you ask somebody about that collage. But given the time, we'll skip that. So let me go back to PowerPoint. As I said, bit of an experiment today. Appreciate your patience. Let's skip that, but let me talk briefly about how I analyze this stuff, and then I'll try to answer a few questions. And I can stick around for a few extra minutes. I know that's not fair to ask of others, but we will keep this recording. So those of you who have to run, we'll make sure you get it. When you're analyzing the information that comes from this stuff, the first step is to cut anything irrelevant or incomplete, and then get everything into a common format. So if you've got like 3 people taking notes, some people are jotting things on Post-its, some people are putting it in a spreadsheet, get it all in one place. And then I said this earlier, but follow your instinct. It's as much art as science. It's not as quantitative as certain other methods. So you don't have to try to force that on it. But I would expect to spend about 2 hours of analysis for every hour you spent facilitating. So again, a 3-hour session, 6-ish hours to actually analyze all of it. So when I talk about keeping the artifacts, it doesn't have to be the physical stuff. You could take photos and keep the photos. It could be digital. You don't have to even, necessarily keep the stuff, the collage itself. You could do, capture the number of times words were used or pictures were used. So somehow capturing all of it in a common place is the key. So take all that raw data, notes, photos, videos, etc., get it into a standardized format. A lot of people I know like to get it into spreadsheets, whether it's key notes, key findings, like 1 thought per cell. Other people like to do Post-its, and in the olden days, they would have been Post-its on a whiteboard, or you could use Mural or Miro or other tools, and they might put 1 thought or 1 insight on each Post-it. Whatever it is, standardize, okay? Then start making clusters. Cluster all the insights first by each participant. See what emerges. What do you see? Any patterns? Then create different clusters based on opportunity. What are the opportunities that people identified? And take them and put them in clusters and see what kind of affinities are there. You could also look for other types of themes and affinities. So if like 3 out of 4 people mentioned some random thing that you didn't know or didn't expect, there's a theme that has emerged for you, and you can dig in a little bit about what that meant. And then you can also look for the patterns that people have experienced that might be similar in their lives. This is just a very abstract semantic way that I think about how people talk about their experiences and how those insights emerge. And then what comes out of that can take a couple different forms. It could be as little as just a future focus area, like, okay, this tells us we need to go focus on this other thing. Or it might tell us some design principles for the solutions that we're going to need to figure out how to build. It might be a little bit more specific, like actual features and characteristics. Those magic objects will sometimes tell you literally a feature list. And sometimes it'll be as far along as a viable solution concept or even some prototypes. So it can be anywhere on that spectrum. But this is the kind of high level of how I would describe the analysis process for this type of work. Not that wildly different from other types of qualitative research, but maybe different if you're used to more quantitative. So I want to take a few minutes to answer a couple quick questions. I know we're at time, but if you guys are sticking around for a few, I will as well. And in the mural, by the way, I'm not going to go back to the mural, but there is another section in the mural that was at the bottom that was reflection and takeaways. If you're in the mural, that mural is going to be open indefinitely. So if you want to play around in there, if you want to add any reflections, key takeaways, or things like the questions that I didn't answer, you can add them there. And I will actually save a version of that mural. And I think I might be able to save it as a PDF. If you guys want to see it, I can include it or we can send it to folks. I'll look into making sure we can do that. So let me talk for another 2 minutes or so. Let me go back up here. Doesn't remote participatory design exclude participants that are less tech savvy and therefore not properly represent a diverse base? Absolutely yes. Absolutely yes. I mean, that is 100% true. You can talk to people that are less tech savvy if all you're asking them to do is get on the phone or use a smartphone with FaceTime. But if you are going to get down to the level of folks who may not even have reliable data access or Wi-Fi access or, you know, broadband, the ability to actually be on a phone or something with video, yeah, you are. And that is an unfortunate fact that you have to look for other ways to find those folks. And until we're allowed to group people, be in groups with people in person in a safe way, that might just be the unfortunate reality. There's some research we're doing right now that is with underserved populations that in other times we would have absolutely have done in person. We would have gone to community centers, urban community centers. We would have found folks that right now I know we are absolutely not finding because we need people to be able to use WebEx or another type of screen share tool. So totally valid. And unfortunately, participatory design via remote methods isn't going to be the way to reach a lot of those folks for now. But we can reach a good portion of folks, even those with less tech savvy, just not the bare minimum. Because you can do a lot of this, as I said, with a smartphone, as long as they can do a video chat, or even if they can't do a video chat, you could have them do some of the activities and then take photos and send them to you. Quick question about the digital platform, digital journal platforms. Digital journal platforms, Google the term. There are a lot of new companies that have cropped up. I've used D-Scout the most, D like lowercase d, Scout. There are a couple others that are out there. We don't use it a ton. We use it, that's a lie. We do use digital platforms, but we don't use it enough that I would say that like any one is better than another. Basically where those might come in handy here is that those are tools that those companies create apps and platforms that make it easier for participants to upload video and other types of media. If you're doing something that's longitudinal over time, that's where that would be valuable, because you can have people upload or respond to prompts like at different times of day or over days and weeks. So you can almost in a way kind of do participatory design via the digital journal platform, but that does not afford you the ability to talk live with somebody and ask them like deeper questions and laddering and saying why, and tell me more, and tell me about a time that happened. You can do that as a follow-up, absolutely. So that's kind of where these things might merge together. But the digital journal platforms might just be a good vehicle for sharing and uploading of artifacts. But so far, we've had good luck just asking people to text or email those. I have used Miro, M-I-R-O, a little bit, but I don't know enough about it to compare to Mural. I've used Mural a lot more, so I can't really offer much there. We are recording this Zoom session. We will share that. How do you make sense of conflicting insights? So hopefully some of what I talked about here helped with that, but there's no such thing as conflicting insights. What you have are different perspectives and different experiences. So if things sound totally contradictory coming from different participants, that's awesome, because that gives you a place to dig. You're like, okay, this person had this experience, this person had this experience. What caused that difference? Is it a difference in their own mental models? Is it a difference in their behaviors? Is it a difference in, you know, their persona, their mindset? Is it a difference in the actual experience that they had that could be validated in terms of like what they actually experienced physically or what have you? Hopefully you have a means to try to uncover some of that. And if you can't, you might be able to follow up, or you could try to kind of use what you know about the broad experience outside of this one research session to inform. But those are actually usually some good sources for epiphanies, is when you see different types of things between people. I see people saying goodbye. Let me check to see if there are any other good ones. Oh, do you have suggestions for introducing the concept of co-design when you have limited time to do other, to also do the substantive activities? The way that I think co-design is best sold when needs to be is that it is like a 2-for-1. It is both research and idea generation. If you do it well and you plan it right, even if it's a very short session or you don't have a lot of time for it, it's like I've said earlier, it's not so much about the specific magic of like one activity. It's the way that you are inviting people into the design process and giving them some opportunity, even if it's just one activity and one conversation, to build a thing or talk about a potential future that they want to have. And that's different than some of the other types of more traditional research that I think people are familiar with. So what happens is you get those insights, and then you also get some potential solution guidance. And that's a 2-for-1. That hour gets you 2 things, not just one. So I always use that to kind of justify the fact that it does take a little more time or planning, and it's a little different than some types of research. There's a question here about replacing focus groups with these activities. Yeah, I don't think I've done an actual like old-fashioned conventional focus group like in my time at MadPow. Because a focus group with people sitting around a room and talking is just going to get you the 1 or 2 people that kind of control the conversation, their opinion, but it certainly isn't going to get you a way of knowing what they would build for the future at the level that one of these types of sessions would. How do you decide how much of this to do? Like how many people, when to do another session? The way you answer that is the same way that you answer any other type of research. How do you decide how many people you're going to do usability sessions with? How do you decide how many people you're going to do in-depth interviews with? It comes down to how many different types of quote user groups you have, making sure you touch on all the different segments, whatever they might be. Those might be divided demographically, although I hope not. They might be divided more by role. They might be divided by the types of people that you think have some input that might be different. So, you know, like the age of parenthood or like random things like that. Or it could be that you don't have those segments and you're trying to learn what they might be, what the different behavioral archetypes might be. It could be an insight you're trying to get. So then you've just got one big user group. But you know, there's a magic number like 5 to 7 for each group or distinct type of segment. I always try to do a little more than that. But that's where you really see enough of the patterns emerging after 5 or 7. And then the other thing is, you know, deciding on how many times you might do these sessions has a lot to do with where you're doing it in the design process and what you're trying to answer, what kind of questions you're trying to answer. So I know that's a cop out of an answer, but it's no different than any other research. So all the same rules apply. It's not that different from like interviews. You know, if I think I need 10 interviews to feel good, I probably need 10 people in the sessions, and that could be 10 people in one session, which might be a little large, or that could be 5 people in 2 sessions. Or if I'm doing it remote, like now, it would probably be 3 sessions of 3 or 4 people. Okay, I think I've answered most of the questions. So I am going to stop sharing so you guys can all see my giant face again for one little bit more of time. I really appreciate you guys joining today. You asked some fantastic questions, so much so that I think that's why I ran out of time at the end, and I'm happy for that. Hopefully you were able to gain what I wanted you to, which is a sense of how to do this work. Nobody's an expert on it, really, and nobody's going to be able to just say, I know how to do this perfectly right now, but hopefully you have enough courage to go and try it. And even if it has to be remote, it can be done. And you guys are all totally empowered to do that, I think, at this point. I'm happy to answer questions. If you have things you want to talk about, email me. The recording, the slides, all of that, we will make available very soon. I will add a slide with the couple books that I think I mentioned are good resources. And just let me know if you give it a try and it goes well or it doesn't go well, like let me know. I love to hear about it. If you're planning something and want me to kind of weigh in a little bit, I'm happy to help. So hope this was helpful. Thank you for bearing with me, especially as I experimented with the mural component. So I appreciate it, everyone. Thanks so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.